But today we're going to get into the High Renaissance, the early Mannerism, and the second period of Mannerism. Therefore, once again, while you're taking notes, it'll alleviate that feeling that I have to write all of this down. You know you already have a summary. On the vocabulary list that indicates additional vocab of the show, I'm going to go over all of them except the first word, Arcadian, and I'm not going to go over the word Saltier, which is the second from the bottom. Bowl, we already talked about. Frieze, we spoke of. Member, Pastilia, Predella, and today I'm going to talk about stippling. So we almost completed this list. But just again, just so that you know what words we have gone over, you don't have to worry about writing down the definitions. You already have them in print. Okay? Okay, so in our last presentation a week ago, we continued exploring the history, the paintings, and the artists of the trade in Quattrocento. But in particular, we spoke of certain artists, and we spoke of Luca Signorelli. Do you remember that piece? Okay. That was the Lamentation over the Dead Christ. With Luca's work, we highlighted his treatment of figures in his particularly striking format, and of course his use of foreshortening, which is an amazing perspective skill. We also talked about the fact that dissection of the human body was something that he must have taken part in because he had such a wonderful understanding of the human body. In his piece, we see the dead Christ. I think it's worthy to note that the dead Christ is believed to be the figure of his son, who had recently died of the plague while he was executing this painting. So that may very well be a portrait of his son. We also shared a short summary of the early Renaissance. Kimberly, do you think we could turn the lights down a little bit in this area? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, this is just a review. We shared a short summary of the early Renaissance, the workings of the guild, the specifics of the contracts when an artist was commissioned. We talk about the obstacles that women faced when they were in the art world or trying to get into the art world. And then you were introduced to the Dominican priest Savonarola, and we talked about the bonfires of the vanities. That brought us to the artwork of Sandro Botticelli and his work, The Annunciation. We spoke about the Annunciation having the look of a low relief that would have been on a frieze, and we spoke of the architectural elements of a pediment and a frieze. We were also giving Botticelli the attention to the kind of perspective he used. And in particular, this kind of technique that he would use, where he would take the panel, he would gesso a primer onto the panel, and then he would etch into that his lines of perspective. He would incise into that. Then he would paint over it. So perspective and the accuracy of perspective was highly important to Sandro Botticelli. Another thing that Sandro Botticelli was known for is these beautiful expressions on the faces of his figures. But one of the things that we do have to remember is that the piece that we are getting from this collection, even Archibald McClellan, the owner and the buyer of this piece, considered this a possibility of being a copy of a Botticelli, not necessarily a Botticelli. And what brought that into question was that architectural element which we call a member or a column, because it was a bit askew. Many people had considered it right up until 1855. It was in a catalog as a column because of not knowing for sure whether it was an assistant who may have finished the piece or an assistant who actually painted in the style of his master, which, as you well know, was what was encouraged. So the fact that it could even be confused just says a lot about the students. We also talked about the Venetian School of Painting, which if we were to condense it right down to a Venetian School of Painting for Dummies, we would just say it was known for its glowing, rich colors. And that is what the Venetian School really put out there in terms of its artists. Obviously, would also have atmospheric perspective, those high views that it would bring into play. But when you think of the Venetian School, think of those wonderful glowing colors. We spoke in particular of Giovanni Bellini, and Giovanni Bellini was considered the greatest of the Venetian early Renaissance painters. his greatest contribution being his experimentation with oil paints. And as we discussed when we talked a little bit about the Netherlandish school of art, we knew that the use of oil paint was only new to the people in Italy. It was already being used in Northern Europe many, many centuries before on leather shields, because there was more, elasticity to the paint itself to be on leather. Now, I don't want to give you the misgivings that Giovanni Bellini had heard about oil, went out, got some oil, and started experimenting. Giovanni Bellini had the wonderful experience of actually knowing Albrecht Dürer. And if any of you have the background of Albrecht Dürer, he was one of the finest painters and printmakers of the Northern Renaissance. And so Albrecht Dürer had visited Venice a couple of times, and on his second time, he actually wrote that he was taken very well care of by Giovanni Bellini, and wrote that he was the best painter in the city. And he showed courtesy and generosity toward foreign brethren of the brush. So it was Giovanni Bellini's perhaps rubbing elbows with some of the people of the Northern Renaissance that brought this wonderful new medium to the attention of the artists of Italy, and he being sort of the pioneer in exploring the use of oil paint. We're also going to see today, when we start to study a little bit more into the Cinquecento, that one of the students of Bellini, because obviously he was a master, one of his students, his former students, really gave him a run for his money. At one point, God bless you. At one point, one of his students said that he wanted equal position as a sole master of a large commission that was given to Bellini that he was supposed to assist in the hall of the Great Council. And he also demanded, this student also demanded, that he get equal pay as this master artist Giovanni Bellini. Well, at first his petition and application for the position as being equal to Bellini, as well as the contracted amount being paid, was accepted. But then it was rescinded, and then a year later was accepted again. And as a result, this little whippersnapper of an assistant ended up going on and becoming kind of a name for his own. His name was Titian. We also talked about Biagio Catena, who did Virgin and Child with St. Mary Magdalene and another female saint. And it was the other female saint that we actually spent some time with to try to unlock some of the iconography to decide whether or not this was in fact St. Catherine or if it was St. Olive. So we talked about that quite extensively. And then we looked at the piece called St. Catherine Crowned with Thorns by Bartolomeo Veneto. And he studied also under Bellini. And he's best known for his portrait work. And in this piece, we started making some comparisons with Veneto's work with Leonardo da Vinci's work, in particular the Mona Lisa. This particular saint was being portrayed without a halo. She had that little mysterious smile. She had that three-quarter view. She used sfumato as well as the chiaroscuro that we always associate with Da Vinci. But we also noticed something that Veneto adds to this. Bartolomeo Veneto was a person who had quite attention to detail, the precision in which he painted. In some ways, sometimes flattened the composition because the precision became so evident. But we also know that he was a portrait artist, and although he was portraying a saint with no halo, he gave us the iconography with the jasmine flowers in her hair to let us know of her virginity, as well as that spiked wheel that we saw, which was the iconography for her martyrdom when she was ordered to be torn, her body be torn apart from this wheel with the spikes. So all of this information was there in a symbolic form, although the halo was missing. So that's pretty much, I'm sorry, we had one more that we looked at. We looked at the Adoration of the Magi, and this was by the master of Glasgow, because we didn't know precisely who painted this piece. And one of the things we talked about is that this was probably part of a much larger polyptych, because the composition seemed to be askew. It seemed to be farther to one side than another, where other panels may have completed the composition. We spoke of the three kings being three different ages and how they all had sort of a different role in this nativity scene. And we also talked about the fact that it was recently cleaned so that we could see that in the background there was the suggestion of a pagan temple, and in that temple there were relief sculptures suggested of pagan gods. Again, a very traditional way of portraying the Nativity, where the temple would be in ruin because the Christ child had been born, because it is going to eliminate those old ways and start a new religion. But another thing about this particular painting that's worth noting to the public is a technique called pastilla. And pastilla is when they take gesso and they make a little bit of a raised area, which would have been used in the decoration of the robes and the jewels and the crowns, and they're covered with gild. And you know what gild is because we went in great detail about the bowl and the gild and the whole idea of the gold that's used on the painting. So that's what we talked about in Tre and Quattrocento, the 1300s and 1400s. So now we're ready to move on to Cinquecento, which is the 1500s, which in the catalog book, it's referred to as a time where the artists go toward a new beauty. Now the 1500s are what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the paintings, we're going to look at the artists, we're going to talk about the history that will be part of our exhibit. But first, before we talk about what's going to be in our exhibit, I want to share with you the art and the artists that will not be in our exhibit. And it breaks my heart to think that they're not, but it's not going to be something that's going to stand in our way to be able to know about it. So at this point, I'm going to give a very respectful shout out to our women artists who worked during the 1500s. Museum visitors are often surprised to discover how many other women were successful in the arts before Mary Cassatt. Pliny, you know the ancient writer, Pliny the Elder, the ancient Roman writer, he cited several examples of women in the arts, and they were painters as well as sculptors. But there's very little said about these pioneers, mainly because Pliny only wrote down their first names. And in doing so in his writings, it's nearly impossible to match the artifact with the name of the artist. So, as you can guess, these poor women have been lost in the annals of art history. Likewise, if you take a look at the medieval time period, many of the nuns were the ones who were sitting there creating those wonderful manuscript illuminations as well as the monks. But once again, because you didn't sign things in the medieval time period, many of the associations of the women with the art that they did has been lost over the years and has not been mentioned. But the Renaissance gives us a wonderful opportunity because humanism really started to be understood and honored in the idea of individual artists, and what they would do was supposed to gain recognition for them. And because of this humanistic way of thinking, artists began to sign their artwork. So we now have the opportunity as art historians to record and to celebrate both the women and the men who were working during this time. But as we talked about even last time, there were a lot of barriers for women in terms of them becoming artists. The extraordinary women that we will know about today had to overcome daunting obstacles to establish successful careers as artists. This in particular is true in such fields as painting and in sculpture. You have to understand that pottery making and weaving and quilting, those, any of the tapestries, those were far more lucrative art careers for women because they could do those and were accepted from doing those. The training for those things could also be done at home. If a woman wanted to become an artist, they weren't allowed to be part of the guild system. They weren't allowed to live in a master's house and to learn from a master artist. Even as something as simple as during this time period, think about how cumbersome their clothing was. To be able to be sculptors and painters, just their clothing alone made it very, very difficult for them. Also, society didn't allow women to travel unaccompanied. And to have them stay at home was really the most honorable and respectful thing for them to do. This didn't allow them to rub elbows with other artists. It didn't allow them to travel to see artwork in other cities or to meet art people in other cities who were doing different things. So once again, it was something that stood in their way. You have to also understand that they were not allowed to go to art schools. And during the Renaissance time, artists were highly trained. And the thing that they were trained in most exclusively from any other art was the drawing of anatomy. And that is the basis. If you think about it, the human figure was really the most important thing in the High Renaissance art period when you think of the religious pieces that were being done, the mythological pieces, the historical pieces, the combination of many figures in one. When we look at the art that we're going to see today, you're going to see multitudes of new figures. And this really set you apart as an artist. If you were good at that, that really was your claim to fame. Now you have a woman who's not allowed to study the nude, not allowed to study anatomy. So that puts her kind of behind the 8 ball to start with right away.
Who made that determination?
Men. Well, you've got to think about who determines any of this. It's usually your professors, your people of the church, your elders, and tradition alone. I mean, it certainly was in the format of, a woman must be modest. These things are high. I mean, it was just something that was unacceptable for a woman to do. And the thing is, I just shared this with Kimberly, and I'm going a little bit ahead of time, because during the time period of the 1600s, which we'll talk about the next time we're together, in the 1600s, you have the artist Artemisia Gentileschi. And one of the things she was most accused of, even though she was highly revered in her lifetime as an incredible artist, she was often said to not possess ingenio. Ingenio was impossible for a woman to have, and that is the gift of genius. And there's treaties on how women could not have the gift of genius because they are reduced to the actions of an animal, which is called childbirth.
Child what?
Childbirth. Are you kidding me? So, as you can see, in some ways, we've gone light years from the 1500s. Today, when I share this with you, I think you're going to see that we sometimes shoot right back to the 1500s, and we have a lot of work to do. And if anyone looks up at me and says, well, there's one of those feminist art historians again, I just want to say that to all of the men in this, I invite you and implore you to join me as a feminist, because any bias of inequality should be banished.
Absolutely.
Right? Thank you. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox just so that I can get back to sharing this with you. Most of the 16th and 17th century women artists were the children or the spouses of established artists. And that gave them the distinct advantage of having the tools, as well as the studios, as well as the training of a man. So as you'll see as we continue to look at the artwork of some of these women, we're going to see that they did have that connection, which helps them a lot. All right, so we're going to go from that comment that documents prove the existence of professional women artists dating back to antiquity. By the time of the Renaissance, the female artist does emerge. This is our first artist. This is her self-portrait. This is Sofonisba Anguissola. Okay? She's a late Italian Renaissance painter who was born in Cremona, Italy in 1532. She received a well-rounded education that included the fine arts. Her apprenticeship with local painters set a precedent for women to be accepted as students in art. In 1554, at the age of 22, Anguissola traveled to Rome, where she spent her time sketching various scenes and people. Here she was introduced to an artist, Michelangelo, and he immediately saw her talent. Meeting Michelangelo was a great honor for Anguissola, and she had the benefit of being informally trained by this great master. When Michelangelo requested Anguissola to draw a weeping boy, Anguissola drew this, called Boy Bitten by a Crayfish, and she sent it back to him. And he immediately recognized she was someone to work with. Michelangelo subsequently gave Anguissola sketches from his notebooks to draw on her own and to develop her own style, and he offered advice on the results of whatever she drew. For at least 2 years, Anguissola continued this informal study, receiving substantial guidance from Michelangelo. Now, although Anguissola enjoyed significant encouragement, much more support than the average woman of her day, her social class did not allow her to transcend the stigma of her sex. She was from a family of minor nobility, so she couldn't climb the ladder as quickly as she should. Without the possibility of studying anatomy or drawing from life, which, as I had already said, was unacceptable for a lady to draw or to view nudes, she could not undertake the complex, multi-figured compositions required for large-scale religious or historic paintings. Instead, she experimented with new styles of portraiture, setting subjects informally. She traveled to Milan, where she painted the Duke of Alba. The art historian Giorgio Vasari, which I've quoted more than once, wrote about Anguissola, and he wrote, "She has shown greater application and better grace than any other woman of our age in her endeavors in drawing. She has thus succeeded not only in drawing, coloring, and painting from nature and copying excellently from others, but by herself has created rare and very beautiful paintings." The Queen of Philip II of Spain, Elizabeth of Valois, was a keen amateur painter. Anguissola was recruited to go to Madrid as her tutor with the rank of lady-in-waiting. She later became an official court painter to the king and adapted her style to a more formal requirement of official portraits for the Spanish court. These types of paintings were far more demanding than the informal portraits Anguissola had based her early reputation. They took a tremendous amount of time and energy to render many intricate fabrics and jewels and designs of finery associated with royal subjects. Despite the challenge, Anguissola's paintings were vibrant and full of life. While in the service of the Queen, Anguissola worked closely with another artist, Coelho. So closely, in fact, that the famous paintings of the middle-aged King Philip II were long contributed to Coelho and not her. Only recently has Anguissola been recognized as the painting's creator. Self-portraits and family members were most frequently the subject she painted, but in her later life she also painted religious themes. Unfortunately, many of her religious paintings have been lost. After the Queen's death, Philip II took a special interest in Anguissola's future. He wished her to marry, so he found a noble person of the Spanish court that he asked her to wed. But then he soon discovered that she was already engaged. So nevertheless, because of Philip II's true respect for this woman, he paid a dowry of £12,000 for her impending marriage to a man, Don Francesco de Macada. He was a son of the Prince of Paterno, the Viceroy of Sicily, and she married him in 1571. Don Francesco was said to be very supportive of his wife. After 8 years with the Spanish court, Anguissola and her husband left Spain with the king's permission sometime in 1578. The couple settled in Palermo, where Anguissola's husband died in 1579. At the age of 47, while traveling home to Cremona, Anguissola met a considerably younger man, Orazio Lamellino. He was the captain of the ship on which she was traveling. They were married in Pisa in January of 1580. Lomellino supported Anguissola's career, and they had a long and happy marriage. They settled in Genoa, where her husband's family lived in a very large home. And Guasola was given her own quarters, a studio, and time to paint and draw, which is completely unheard of. She continued to practice as a leading portrait painter, apparently with the support of her two husbands and the former king, because Lomolino's fortune was left to her, plus there was a generous pension from Philip II, and there was also money that came in from her first husband. This allowed Angela Solo to paint freely and to live comfortably. By now, quite famous, Angela Solo received many colleagues who came to visit and to discuss the arts with her. Several of these were younger artists eager to learn and mimic Angela Solo's distinctive style. In 1624, now this particular portrait that you see was done in 1610. She was 78 years old here, and this is her self-portrait that she did. In 1624, which was 14 years after this painting, Anguissola was visited by a Flemish painter, Sir Anthony van Dyck. He recorded sketches of his visit of her and her paintings in his sketchbook. Van Dyck noted that although her eyesight was weakened, Anguissola was still mentally alert at 92 years old. Excerpts of the advice that she gave him about painting still survive today. Van Dyck drew her portrait while visiting her. The next year, she returns to Sicily, and contrary to later biographers' claims, she was never totally blind. She may have suffered from cataracts. Anguissola became a wealthy patron of the arts after the weakening of her sight, and in 1625 she died at the age of 93 in Palermo. 7 years later, on the anniversary of what had been her 100th birthday, her husband placed an inscription on her tomb that read in part, "To Sophonisba, my wife, who is recorded among the illustrious women of the world, outstanding in portraying the images of man. Orazio Lomolino, in sorrow for the loss of his great love in 1632, dedicated this little tribute to such a great woman, Orazio Lomolino." Her great success opened the way for larger numbers of women to pursue serious careers as artists. Anguissola was significant to feminist art historians. Although there has never been a period in Western history in which women were completely absent in the visual arts, Anguissola's great success opened the way for a larger number of women to pursue serious careers as artists. Some of her followers were Lavinia Fontana and also Artemisia Gentileschi. I have to talk to you off the record about this particular piece. I don't know how many of you think this, but I think this shows such an incredible insight into painting. This could be a John Singer Sargent, as far as I'm concerned. The lighting, the attention to detail. Look at the furs, look at the face just glows. There's nothing, when I saw this piece, I have to honestly say, after studying and researching these 500 years of art, after a while, they become very heavy in some ways, and they start to look an awful lot like each other. This just it stands apart from anything that was going on at this time. But here's the thing that's heartbreaking. This piece is owned by the Museum of Glasgow, and it's not part of our collection that's coming here. That made me gasp when I saw that that's where it is. Because although we may, like I said, have come light years, we certainly slipped back right to where we were in terms of recognition of women in the arts. Look at the artists that we're studying that we don't even know their names. We're not even sure if they're from Italy. Oh, this one could be from Spain, or maybe he's from Venice, but we're not sure, but we're just going to call him the master of Glasgow. Yeah, I mean, we're still pulling other pieces in and not giving Sophonisba Anguissola the respect and the look of being a master artist that she deserves. So that's why today we give her a shout out. We're not going to whisper her name behind the veil of she was a great artist. We're going to say she is and will always be a great artist. And her last piece, to just bring a little joy back to this whole retrospective, Angela Solo once said, Life is full of surprises. I try to capture these precious moments with wide eyes. And this is her piece. The next artist we're going to look at is the artist Lavinia Fontana, who again is another a woman from the 1500s. She was an Italian painter who was born in Bologna in 1552. She's regarded as the first woman artist working within the same sphere as her male counterparts outside of a court painter or a convent. Okay, so this is one who is just right out there with the general population of male artists. Her father was a prominent painter of the school of Bologna. This is why she could get into where she got into. And at that time, in Bologna in their school of art was very well known for being eclectic and having a high regard for women in the arts. So that was another bonus. She was born in the right place at the right time. Her earliest known work was painted in 1575 when she was at the age of 23. She would go on to paint a variety of genres. Early in her career, she was most famous for painting upper-class residents of her native Bologna. She began her commercial practice by painting small devotional paintings on copper, which had a very popular appeal to the papal and the diplomatic gift-giving. Like if the Pope wanted to give a gift, he would buy one of her pieces. If a diplomat wanted to buy a gift, he would buy one of her pieces. So her work was out there. And it was given, the reason it was given so much value was because it had a luster to it because it was painted on metal. In addition to portraits, that typical subject matter for women painters, she later created large-scale paintings with religious and mythological themes, which sometimes included nudes. Fontana married Paolo Zappi, and she gave birth to 11 children. After marriage, Fontana continued to paint to support her family. Zappi, her husband, took care of the household and served as a painting assistant for his wife, including painting minor elements of the paintings like the draperies. So he was the assistant to her. Fontana and her family moved to Rome in 1603 at the invitation of Pope Clement VIII. She gained the patronage of the Buona Compagnia, which means good company. She became a member of that, of which Pope Gregory XIII was also a member. So she was obviously in a status that someone like Sofonisba was not allowed to be part of because of her lack of nobility. Thankfully, Lavinia Fontana was recognized for her ability, not the lack of nobility. Lavinia thrived in Rome as she had in Bologna, and Pope Paul V himself was among her sitters. She was a recipient of numerous honors, including a bronze portrait medallion cast in 1611 in her honor. Some of her portraits often were lavishly paid for, but they were given credit to the artist Guido Reni. Okay, so once again, if it's a really good painting and we're going to sell it for a lot of money, let's give a male artist the credit. I'm telling you, I am not making this up. They would even paint over the name of the female artist and put the artist's name down oftentimes because they knew it would sell better. Sometimes they didn't even bother to take the female name off. They just added the male name and it made it so that it was to their credit. Judith Leister, who was painting in the 1600s in the Dutch area in Holland, her name was right on there, and they kept putting Frans Hals names on it and selling them as Frans Hals pieces and having them in museums saying this is a Frans Hals. And Judith Leister's name is right there still on the painting. But this is what got the money from the patrons. You're only going to sell things and do these things if that's what the public wants. And unfortunately, that's how the public was looking at it.
And the female artist went along with that?
The female artist who was dead by then.
Oh.
This was after the female artist.
Okay.
Okay. While her youthful style was much like her father's, she gradually became more and more like Caravaggio. Now, this is Fontana's work.
This is Judith of Holofernes. Okay, this is Fontana's work. This is Caravaggio's work. This is Artemisia Gentileschi's work. Okay, I can see the red drapery in both places, but in terms of lighting, I see that they're to me equivalent. In terms of composition, again, I see more of an equivalence here. If we're going to make a comparison with Fontana to Caravaggio, I can't see why we can't make that same comparison with another female artist, Artemisia Gentileschi. But this is often how female artists are often compared. They're compared with a major male artist so that it justifies how good their work is. I put all three because we'll justify it. I love Caravaggio. We'll go down and say he's one of our favorite artists.
Yeah.
But let's not forget Artemisia Gentileschi has equal, if not better, portrayal.
Look how gentle the woman is in Caravaggio's.
That's-
Look how brutal the women are.
Well, that's because, that's another thing. Artemisia Gentileschi's piece was in the back hall in the gallery for hundreds of years because women were never supposed to show that kind of violence, especially against a man. All right? The reason Artemisia Gentileschi could be so good at doing this was because she was raped. And as a result, this is almost a portrayal of her rape. The blood on the sheets, the wrestling, the tearing away. This kind of imagery comes from a woman. Note Suzanne and the Elders. There's many paintings of Suzanne and the Elders. Look at the ones that were done by men. Look at the ones that were done by women. The ones that are done by men often look like, oh, look at how he's looking at me and looking sort of coyish, but a little sexual. When you look at them when they're done by a woman, you see the embarrassment and the cowering. There's a difference. You've got a man representing something that's happening emotionally to a woman versus a woman representing what happens to a woman. So you can see that the women, if I was to make a comparison, these were the two that I would compare. Unfortunately, art historians are going to compare these two. So, this is the work of Lavinia Fontana. Well, like I said, she started out like her father's style. She does pick up the styles, and I will just say the Baroque styles that we see in both Caravaggio and Artemisia Gentileschi's work. She was elected into the Accademia di San Luca of Rome and died in the city on August 11, 1614. There are over 100 works that are documented, but only 32 of them are signed and dated works that we know of today. So like I said, we're about to start Cinquecento, but I couldn't start without giving you at least some time to see what the women also contributed to a wonderful time going towards a new beauty. Those are the things you won't see. Now, these are the things you will. During the Cinquecento, we have the time period called the High Renaissance. The classical humanism was a major factor, and there is a book that I think that we'll put out for people to know about. One of your fellow docents has just shared with me that there's a wonderful piece of literature out right now that talks a lot about humanism and will really open your minds and eyes to what humanism was all about, which the High Renaissance was really built off of that concept. The movement was based on the idea that every person's life had value and dignity, and it stressed man's position in the world. And as a result, because of the humanists believed that they should look to the classical writings and the art of the ancient Greeks and Romans as exemplary guides, not the end product, but as guides. They saw that as something they would study and then surpass in terms of excellence. And in doing this, they began, because of that self-assuredness, because of the dignity that they desired and earned and got, they began signing their artwork. Although continuing with religious themes, artists of the High Renaissance added more of their individual spirit and their personal vision to their work. One of the artists that we will speak of, and this is his real name, Tiziano Bichelli, but in English we call him Titian. Okay? Tiziano Bichelli, known in English as Titian, was the most important member of the 16th century in terms of the Venetian School of Art. He was born in Cadore, and this is a republic of Venice, and during his lifetime, he was referred to as Tiziana da Cadore, which just meant Titian of Cadore. That's where he's from. Now, recalling the famous line of Dante's Paradiso, his contemporaries called him the sun amidst small stars. So he was highly revered even by his contemporaries and certainly well respected by the art world. Titian was one of the most versatile of painters. He was equally skilled in portraiture, landscapes, in terms of backgrounds that he put in his work, mythology, and religious subjects. His painting methods, especially in the application and the use of color, would be profound and be a huge influence on what was happening in the Italian Renaissance, as well as for future generations of the Western art world. His artistic approach was drastically changed throughout his lifetime, but he retained his lifelong interest in color, even though his approach may have changed. His mature works may not contain the vivid luminosity tints. In his early pieces, however, his loose brush strokes and the subtlety of tone became the standard in the history of Western art. And those loose brush strokes, as you know, is what's going to continue and bring you into the Baroque. All right, those kinds of things you see that he's stepping forward. At the age of 10 to 12 years old, his father sent him and his brother to work as an apprentice for a master painter. He entered the studio originally of Gentile Bellini. Gentile was Giovanni's brother, but then he was later transferred to Giovanni Bellini's studio. At this time, the Bellini brothers were truly the leading artists of the city. Remember, this is when he was 10 to 12 years old. Titian also became friends with other painters during that time period, one of them being Giorgione. Now, they became assistants together in painting commissions, and distinguishing between their works has become a scholarly controversy and a headache. Let me show you why. The piece on the left is by Giorgione. The background in Giorgione's piece is painted by Titian. The piece on the right was completely painted by Titian. So you can see why many art historians have had a very difficult time distinguishing, is it a Giorgione or is it a Titian? Now, the reason I bring this up is because there's that same kind of controversy that went on for a while for the piece that we have here. There has been a sizable movement of provenance from Giorgione to Titian, but very little, if any, from Titian to Giorgione. Okay. These two young masters were recognized as the two leaders of the new school of what they called arte moderna, which is modern art. Okay. Characterized by paintings made more flexible, freed from symmetry, and the remnants of their traditional formal conventions that were still found in Bellini's work. And after Giorgione's early death, Titian continued to paint sort of on Giorgione's subjects for some time, though he did develop his own style with that bold and expressive brushwork that we will credit to him. A major painting contribution to the Venetian school was his emphasis on nature as a setting. He showed a bold new composition for such a traditional religious subjects by putting the focal point of the Madonna and the Child off-center. I mean, those sound like such simple little things, but those were such big things during this time in terms of being revolutionary. He used colors to enliven the composition, and if any of you have ever painted and went down to any store to buy paints, you know that there's a paint called Titian Red. So that is definitely why it's called Titian Red. He used those bright, bright colors. The skillful use of sumptuous color became his hallmark. And he created a formula to establish harmony and balance through color and counterbalances. Titian's presence in Spain later influenced Spanish artists, including people like Velázquez, as well as also Rubens. Giorgione dies in 1510. Giovanni Bellini dies in 1516, leaving Titian totally unrivaled in the Venetian school of painting. So towards 1521, he was at the height of his fame, executing great scale pieces, colorism, creating sensations, planning his work with supreme displays of order and freedom, originality and style. He was free to do whatever he wanted because he was going to be the best regardless. He was made a Count Palatine and a Knight of the Golden Spur. And this is the medal that you get if you are a Knight of the Golden Spur. This is a papal order of chivalry given to those who have rendered distinguished service in spreading the Catholic faith. During the time of our artist Titian, when you were given this award, you were a knight and your entire family was given the status of nobility. As time went on, the importance was still there, but how you got it got a little different. You could pay a fee, and you could get one of these. So then they stopped giving them. But then they were revived, maybe we can say. The revival of the order was in the 20th century when Pope Pius X restored it to the status of a separate order in 1905. Instead of it being something where you became a Knight of the Church, you became the Knight of the Virgin Mary. It was it was done on the Jubilee of the Immaculate Conception, and it was placed under the patronage of the idea of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And as a result, it now allows you to be considered a knight, but it does not boost you to nobility, nor does it affect anybody in your family, and you can't pay for it to get it. In modern times, the order has only one class, that's knight, and its membership has been restricted to 100 knights throughout the world. It's awarded solely for merit without any consideration for noble birth or giving any nobility to the person who receives it. And it's the second highest of all papal orders. The current member of the Golden Spur is His Royal Highness Jean, the Grand Duke of Luxembourg. And at this moment, he's the only living knight that there is at this point. The past recipients included Raphael, obviously Titian, Giorgio Vasari, Casanova, Mozart, and between 1919 and 1980, the Shah of Iran had this also as nobility. Tiziano, or Titian's children were also, like I said, made nobles of the empire because of his exceptional honor. And in terms of his success, his position during this time that he was awarded this was only equal to Raphael, Michelangelo, and then later Rubens was also given that kind of notoriety. During the last 26 years of his life, Titian mainly worked for Philip II as a portrait painter, and he became much more self-critical than he ever was before. He became almost what would be called an insatiable perfectionist. He kept many of his pictures in his studio for 10 years or more to just keep returning to them, to keep improving on them. Now here's another thing that really kind of helps an art historian pull their hair out. He also finished copies of earlier works by his students. So when his students copied his work, which is the way he learned, if they didn't finish the piece, or if he didn't feel that they did it exactly the way he thought they should, he went back and corrected them. This gives rise to many problems with provenance, as you can probably guess. And among versions of his works that were widely copied, there's also fakes that were being done outside his studio during his lifetime and after. So he furnished a new and a more perfect formula for painting, but he certainly, through all this experimentation, made a lot of problems for people to figure out which are Titians and which are not. From the standpoint of flesh tones, his most moving pictures were the pieces that he did of people in old age. He attempted to correct problems with chiaroscuro, and he tried to envelop that whole idea of dark and light by putting them in night scenes, rather than, when we speak of chiaroscuro, when we speak of the Mona Lisa, but the Mona Lisa's chiaroscuro is formed because her hair is so dark and then her face is so light. So oftentimes if we talked of chiaroscuro, it was something that surrounded the light area, but not necessarily a night effect. It was Titian who pushed that even further and said, what happens when light comes forward from darkness because of the day being a dark day? He was at the Council of Trent, which is a huge influence on what happens during the Baroque period in 1555, and he continued to accept commissions to the end of his life. Titian probably died in his late 80s when the plague was raging through Venice and took him on August 27, 1576. He was the only victim of the plague to be given a church burial. If you had the plague, you were buried somewhere far away from everyone else. But because of Titian's status and respect as an artist, he did get a church burial. Immediately after Titian's death, his son and his assistant Orazio died of the same epidemic. His opulent mansion was plundered by thieves during the plague. And that, again, if you read that book, I keep talking about the betrothed, I Promessi Sposi, you will hear all about this, all through that. When the rich and noble people would get sick from the plague, they would take them off and put them almost like in an asylum type situation, and their homes were just devastated by the poor.
What was the name of that book?
It's called The Betrothed. One of his pupils was another artist that we will see his work in the show. His name is Paris Bourdon, but don't confuse that with a French name because his real last name was Bourdonne. The E was dropped and he's called Paris Bourdon. All right, let's take a look at an actual piece by Titian. All right, I know we looked at this many times before when we had the professor from SU here. The painting is called Christ and the Adulteress, and it was originally 12 to 20 inches wider than it is now. It did include a standing figure of a man on the right, and the figure survives as a fragment. And here's that fragment. We're also going to have this piece in the show, okay? The idea of why was this taken apart, well, they found that there was some damage in the right foreground, and perhaps the lower part of the figure was ruined. So that may be why it was cut to kind of salvage the major part of the painting and to use that other piece, the upper part of the right-hand side, as a portrait. It was bought by them. This actual piece was a part of the museum, and 100 years later they bought the portrait part. The painting was at times identified as Daniel and Susanna because of their portrait being away from it. It just sort of, the description of the painting didn't fit what they had, so they started thinking that this was the time when Susanna was insulted by the elders spying on her, and it was Daniel who spoke up for her and saved her reputation, that story. But the older identification of the piece is Christ and the Adulteress, which seems to be a lot more convincing when you think that it was a very popular subject matter in Venetian painting. And the story itself, although, you see a lot of people dressed in contemporary dress of the 1500s. They're not dressed like people of biblical times. But there is one figure in there that does have the story's relevance when it comes to one of the Pharisees who tries to tempt Christ into going against Mosaic law, because they say that they found this adulteress in the act of adultery and she should be stoned by the law. And they ask Christ, should they stone her? And he says that he will show compassion for her. And then the quote that all of you, I'm sure, have all heard, he says, "He who is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." So this is what they now believe is truly the title of this particular painting. And the reason the reference seems a little bit more convincing is because there is a Pharisee in there. There is the movement of Christ as if he's about to stand, because part of the story is that he was writing in the sand. And so you can see that he had just finished like standing up. And in the background, you will also see a medallion of the Roman emperor, and it's set in a wall above Christ, and it serves to locate the event and the period in the New Testament in which this was supposed to have happened. So all of this kind of gives more reference to it being the title that it's given. Now, as you can see, the coloration is glowing and beautiful. The roundness of form, that is certainly a Titian strength. And again, we revisit that whole idea of that green, look at the green wrap around the woman, that she's, reborn because Christ has saved her. We see a lot of the symbolism and iconography that we've seen before. But in terms of, other than Christ and the Pharisee, it's very contemporary in terms of the way the people are dressed. Now, if we take a look at the head of Christ, or the head of a man, I'm sorry, the head of a man, we see that the identification of the painting was obviously up for grabs for many, many years, and it was only 100 years later that it becomes part of this collection because they feel that this was part of, and it's obvious. There's the shoulder of the man that's in the larger piece. For more than a century after McClellan bequeathed this collection to Glasgow, this painting was known as Glasgow Giorgione. They thought this piece was by Giorgione. So again, that confusion between Titian and Giorgione's work. Now, during the first half of the 20th century, a majority of scholars accepted that Giorgione was in fact the artist. But since the 1960s, this view has given way to Giorgione's younger Venetian contemporary Titian, whose work is well documented. And like I said, if you take this and put them side by side, the actual landscape continues perfectly, and the shoulder of, look at this shoulder here.
Yeah.
See this here?
Okay.
Take a look, there's that man's shoulder. So for it to be confused with Giorgione, I think somebody just really wanted a Giorgione painting, and just somebody suggested this. It's reasonable that it was a work that he executed when he was about 20 years old. He was very young, and the painting shows a number of what would be considered faults. The positions of the figures in the actual piece seem a little unstable. They're kind of awkward in terms of their positions. The figures are highly energetic in movement, but the palette shows this extraordinary warmth and richness, and the use of the wide range of pigments with a wide range of contrasting surface textures. This is all attributed to the fact of using oils. This was all capable of being done because of using oil. So let's go on to our next artist, Paris Bourdon. Now, Paris Bourdon's real name is Paris Pascalinus Bordone. So that shows that he was a Venetian Renaissance painter. We know that for sure. He was born in Treviso, which is part of the Venetian mainland, and he apprenticed briefly and unhappily, it's been recorded in Vasari's writings, with Titian. He did not enjoy his time with Titian. By the 1520s, he was producing his own versions of the genres of his master that was practiced by his master. He maintained a strand of manneristic complexity and a provincial spirit. However, Bourdon uses a superior perspective, which creates sort of a dwarfed, distant perspective, because he gets so severe in the perspective that he has in the foreground, it really dwarfs the perspective that he uses in the background. He uses limited coloration when we consider where he was trained by Titian, because Titian just uses brilliant tones and he doesn't. He executed many important murals in Venice, all of which were destroyed. And later in his career, he enjoyed international success in his work for Francis I of France as court painter and doing the portraits of the court, his work for the Fugger Palace in Augsburg. Those have all been lost. So there's not a lot that we have from Bourdon, considering what he did in terms of a successful career. But one of the earliest of many contributions that he makes is this Virgin and Child with Saints Jerome and Anthony Abbot and a donor. Now the Virgin and Child are informally seated, as you can see, with a group of saints off to the left of the Virgin. He has this very idyllic looking pastoral background going on. And what we see is St. Anthony and St. Jerome, who are acknowledging the presence of a kneeling donor. So this is the man who would have paid to have the painting done. He's the donor. We have Jerome and St. Anthony sitting there kind of gesturing to the donor to come forward, to come and meet the Virgin Mary and the child Jesus. The patron saint of medicine is St. Anthony. And he's encouraging this little man to come and meet her. Notice there's a curtain, that green, it's sometimes hard to read with this because to me it almost looks like the greenery of the tree, but there's actually this sort of curtained area here. That curtained area allowed Bourdon to make it look as if there was sort of a tent that was sort of put there, you see, because there's sort of a pole, and it gives him that feeling of outside and inside. He wanted to sort of use that kind of setting. So we have that drapery. And what we want to know is that this gives the artist a way to associate his paintings with other themes that were very favored at that time, like the flight into Egypt, the adoration of the Magi, both needing both the landscape as well as some kind of shelter to be portrayed. Other details like the reclining shepherds and their sheep in the left, you'll see that when you see it in person, because I don't think the slide really allows to see that. You're going to see some shepherds, you're going to see some sheep, you're going to see some rustic buildings in the center. These are all very reminiscent of Titian's interpretations of these typical landscapes that he would do. They were both sacred and secular in theme. Now, Bourdon's handling of paint is different from the master's in that he uses very delicate brushstrokes, especially when we take a look at St. Anthony's beard. It almost looks trompe-l'oeil. It's just so soft and so beautifully done. And he also uses another technique, which is called stippling. Stippling is when you paint with dots, okay? And he uses that sort of rhythmic stippling when he does the leaves of the trees. That is definitely Bourdon, not something he brought from Titian. The figures are also slighter in build, and they show less energy. You know, physical energy is not there like we saw with Titian's work. He adopts some of the ideas from Giorgione. Don't forget, Giorgione and Titian had so much going on that were similar that some of the things that he pulls into his own work are things that are from Giorgione's pieces. The earliest record of painting dates back to the mid-17th century when the kneeling donor was identified as Dr. Genova. And he was a physician from Treviso. Okay, remember this is the mainland of Venice. So we know the name of that particular person who's kneeling in front. Dr. Genova's first name is not known. So for a long time people thought, well, maybe that's why they used St. Anthony. Maybe his first name was Anthony. Because a lot of times during this time period, your name was after a patron saint, okay? But we don't know for sure that that was actually his first name. St. Anthony is recognized as the protector against disease and the plague, which would relate it to the fact that he was a doctor. So St. Anthony may have more to do with his career than his first name. Surprisingly, for a doctor, you see him wearing a pair of spurs, and you also see that he has quite a lavish robe on. It almost looks like a knight. And so what he is doing is he's denoting his wealth. He's showing his considerable wealth as a doctor, which of course then would denote the fact that he was very good at what he did, or he wouldn't have that money. This may relate to the donor wanting to indicate that he also had sort of a knightly self-importance. The painting in 1663 described the two saints as two friars in the posthumous inventory of Carlo de' Medici. Now this was in the possession of one of the Medici, and they had it categorized as being two saints who were then shown as friars. The cardinal decided that the portrait of Dr. Genova should be overpainted to become an anonymous cleric. So there was an overpainting on this, which then put it in records as something totally different. A restoration of the painting in 1981 to 1985 revealed that there was a left foot. See that here? Mm-hmm. That foot once belonged to this figure. But this was not an unusual thing to happen. They would do a lot of overpaints. They would readjust the way people sat and the way people had their bodies. If something looked clumsy later, they would paint over it. But in restoration, you remove that layer of paint and all of a sudden you've got this random foot sitting there. Clearly it was intended to be St. Anthony's, but it shifts him into a very bizarre kind of pose as a result.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take a look at this one. This is also by Bourdon, and this is the Virgin and Child with Saints John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, and possibly St. George. Again, it's an informal arrangement of the Virgin and Child with the saints in a very serene pastoral setting. John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene are clearly identifiable because of the iconography. The lamb and the reed cross is used to represent John the Baptist, and the ointment jar is used to represent Mary Magdalene. Now the armored saint, the one that you see on the right, that armored saint could be Saint George, or it could be Saint Liberale. Okay, it could be one or the other, but we don't know for sure because he's holding a banner, but look, we can't see the flag on the top. Maybe at one time this was a larger painting that would have identified which of the two saints it was supposed to represent, but we don't have it to see. The sacrificial lamb is pointed to by John the Baptist, and the goldfinch in the child Jesus' hand indicates that sort of projection of the passion of the Christ child in the future. The warm colors, the intensity of the glowing reds and the blues, and the soft atmospheric landscape are characteristic truly of Venetian painting of the period. Once this was X-ray, it also revealed that there were numerous changes in placing the figures when executing the painting. But it did not leave us with remnants of because of the X-ray and not restoration. You see the difference? Once they remove the paint, all of a sudden something pops up. You X-ray this, you see there were changes, and then you don't remove the paint and have this random foot hanging around. This painting is more grand than Bourdon's Virgin and Child and St. Jerome and Anthony with the donor, because it's elevated to sort of this sort of throne, this sort of rustic throne with a blocking to the right and the background and their classical architecture being shown. The composition is rhythmically much more complex and dynamic, and the Virgin's pose again reflects what we would consider work by Titian. Girolamo da Capo. He's an Italian painter and decorator from Ferrara. He's at the seat of the flourishing Renaissance court that was ruled by the Este dynasty. If any of you have been to Italy and you've gone to Tivoli, you saw all those wonderful fountains at the Villa d'Este, and this is the family that we're talking about. Okay? At 20 years old, the artist moved to Bologna for a brief period. Now, while in Bologna, he came in contact with a very popular artist, Parmigianino. Okay? Parmigianino was a Mannerist, and by seeing his work, he adopted the style of this elegant, elongated figure, and he combines the style of the Farese painters with that of the Bologna school, with his eclectic. You have to understand, the Bologna school of art was very eclectic. Whatever was going on in different regions, and different regions had their own very specific, as you know, the Venetian School of Art, the Sienese School of Art. Whatever was the best for many of these schools, the Bologna School of Art said, well, let's try that. They pulled it in. They were very accepting of the idea of women being trained as artists. So if you went to the Bologna School of Art, there's a chance you're going to be affected by many different schools of art because that's how they taught. Aiming to select and collect all of these wonderful ideas into one excellence, which would become then the Bologna style. The artist was inspired by the Mannerist style that we see here by Parmigianino. And the artist straddles the various influences of that eclectic school and the emerging new styles of Mannerism. Now, what is Mannerism? I'm going to, again, condense this as much as I can. Mannerism is a period of European art that emerges late after the later years of the High Renaissance. You have to understand that the young people who wanted to become noted artists could not just continually fashion their work and style off of the artists that came before them, or they're never going to get anywhere. So what this Manneristic period is they paint in the manner of someone else, but they go beyond it. And instead of studying nature, they study the art of the artist before them and paint in the manner of that. But then they try to give it this sort of, I almost want to say elegance, because they start elongating the figures. They start making it far more, it becomes very unrealistic in many ways, but it becomes very dramatic in terms of coloration. And so this Mannerist school starts off as being notable for sophistication as well as its almost artificial way of portraying human form, because they're trying to get it past what has already been going on during that High Renaissance. Now, as time goes on, that mannerism then becomes a secondary, it's called the second period of mannerism, and this is differentiated because it's totally anti-classical. It's not going to look at the classical artwork that was done in the High Renaissance. It's going to imitate art in a different way, and now it couples that exaggerated elegance with an exquisite attention to surface and to detail, giving porcelain kind of skin to the figures. That's mannerism. And mannerism doesn't go on forever. It's developed about 1510, and it ends not too long afterward, about 1520. It's just sort of that in-between kind of period that influences other artists. So let's take a look at De Carpi's work, and you can see the combination of the elements that are clearly visible in this work. We see influences by the Farnese kind of painting. When we look up at the angels, look at this. I mean, this is something we would have seen, you know, in the High Renaissance. But take a look at the length of these bodies, and then you start to see the influence of the manners. Now, what we see here, the figures are clearly an artist who's been exposed to Parmigianino, and while the mysterious twilight is lighting that landscape with those stormy clouds, we see a sunset that was much like what we would have seen by an artist called Dossi. We also see the ideas of another style when we look at the angels, which would have been by another artist, much like what we saw by an artist named Garofalo. So we see three different artists' kind of techniques coming together under the workings of De Carpi. And you have to understand that these scenes merge actually two separate stories. There's the mystic marriage of St. Catherine and the Christ child. And I don't want this to become something that sounds bizarre. Even nuns, when I was a child, I know that nuns still wore wedding bands because they were married to the church.
Right.
It's not some weirdo thing. It's just the idea that when a woman gives her life in marriage, it's fidelity. It's, you know, it's everything that encompasses love and truthfulness and everything. That's what their pledge is. When you have a woman who then becomes married to the church or becomes married to the Christ child, it is simply those characteristics of marriage: fidelity, true love, complete
Giving.
Yes. And so that's what I want you to understand when it comes to this idea of the marriage of St. Catherine to the Christ child. Notice St. Catherine has no halo. This whole idea of being, brought together with the Christ child as if as being this marriage gives us the significance of her being a saint. You also see the meeting of the Holy Family with the child, John the Baptist, on their way back from the trip from Egypt to Nazareth, okay? That flight into Egypt is now they're returning to Nazareth. This is another story that was written by the Franciscan friar Bonaventure and the Dominican friar Cavacalla, and they wrote the story about St. John the Baptist meeting the family when they were coming back. So in keeping with iconography and the custom of bringing these two stories together, we have holy children who are being tenderly embraced, and we have St. Catherine there. We have St. Joseph poor St. Joseph, he always gets kicked off to the side. Here's St. Joseph, and he's watering the ox, and he's watering the ass off to the side. And we also see in the painting James carrying a pilgrim we see storm clouds. All right, those storm clouds and musicians and the angels up there who are celebrating the meeting of St. John the Baptist and Christ and the meeting of St. Catherine. So it kind of brings all these stories all together. But there are really two stories in one in this piece. The last piece that we're going to take a look at is by Orazio Sammartini. It's oil on white metal, so there should be a sheen to this piece. The painter was also a copperplate engraver, so this gave him obviously the appreciation and the knowledge of how to work with metal. Now his early works mainly reflect the classicism of Raphael and mannerism. Simplicity of form, the calm colors, the purity of line, these all characterize much of his early work. Now he participated in decorating the Vatican, and he worked with a Roman artist named Zuccari, Okay, the work by Zuccotti is on the right, the work by Samachini is on the left. And as a result, a lot of times these compositions are characterized to be one or the other. There's again, the confusion, is this a Zuccotti or is this a Samachino? And you can see why. Their styles are very, very much the same. They have, using those very complicated compositions, they have spaces that are brimming with activity. They clearly articulate the figure, they elongate the figure. Again, seeing that influence of Michelangelo, as well as their complicated compositions, Michelangelo. Think of the Last Judgment. The elongated figures, think of Parmigianino. Okay, those are the artists that would really affect him. The painting we're going to have here is called St. James Major and St. Catherine of Alexandria. Now the two saints are receiving the martyr's crown from a flying angel, and James carries a pilgrim's staff and a hat. Now St. James, this pilgrimage to honor St. James becomes very, very popular, especially during the Baroque period. One of Caravaggio's paintings, there's this little scallop shell on one of the saints at a table, and that's because he made the pilgrimage for St. James. That was sort of the symbol, this little shell. It's a reference, this painting is a reference to that most very important pilgrimage that would have been done during the Middle Ages all the way up through into the Baroque time. St. James Shrine is in Spain, okay, and so that was another connection there. Now, at Catherine's feet are the instruments of her martyrdom. We've seen this more than once. You know, the spiked wheel, so we know that that's her. And then, because remember I talked to you about it, they tortured her so much that the people were starting to really get against it, so he throws her into jail and then she's beheaded. Okay, so that's the sword in which she was beheaded. So that iconography helps us know what's going on. So this is one of Samachino's work. We have one more work to look at. What we'll do is we'll start with that the next time we're together, and then we'll continue and go into the 1600s. Seicento, right? Seicento.